$80 million. That's what was at stake. On that day, before the eyes of a nation, a live showdown unfolded that no one could have scripted. J.D. Vance, standing alone beneath the glare of cameras, faced off against Jasmine Crockett. The air inside Congress grew heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. And in a single searing moment, the chamber fell silent. What J.D. revealed didn't just shake a room, it rattled a country. But was it the full truth America finally saw? Or just the tip of a betrayal far deeper than anyone imagined? As you follow this story, remember, the names, the stage, the clash, they are imagined. But what they reflect is all too real. The hopes, the fears, the weight of choices, and the fight for what's right. That is the heart of this journey. Let this tale draw you in, not as history, but as a window into questions that still echo today. Dawn broke over the forgotten edges of Ohio with a pale, uneasy light. The sun's first rays slid across rows of empty houses, their windows boarded, their front steps crumbling like the promises that once built them. J.D. Vance stepped out of his car and stood for a long moment, just breathing it in. The stillness wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that follows after hope has packed up and left town. He walked slowly down Main Street, though no one called it that anymore. The sign had rusted off the post years back. On one side, a diner's neon letters hung crooked over shattered glass. On the other, a hardware store's door swung in the breeze, its hinges groaning like an old man's knees. Every step J.D. took echoed too loud, as if the town itself was reminding him that it no longer belonged to the living. But what caught his eye, what stopped him cold, was the playground. A swing moved gently, though there was no child, no wind strong enough to make it sway. The chain squeaked, the metal seat bumping softly against a slide scarred with graffiti. J.D. stared, feeling a weight in his chest. This wasn't just a dead town. This was a graveyard for futures that should have been. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw him. A man J.D.'s age, or maybe younger, hard to tell with the lines stress had carved into his face. The man stepped out from between two abandoned houses, a little girl clinging to his leg. Her hair was tangled and she hugged a stuffed animal so worn the fabric was thin as paper. J.D. approached quietly. The man straightened, wary but not hostile. His clothes were clean but patched. His eyes, those told the real story. "I used to live here," the man said, voice rough as gravel, "before they bought it out, before the prices went where we couldn't follow." J.D. didn't speak. He let the man's words settle, like dust in the air. "They told us it would bring jobs. New investment, they said. Foreign money, building the future." He laughed once, bitter and sharp. "They built empty shells, took the heart of this place and sold it." The girl tugged his hand, whispering, "Daddy, can we go home now?" The man knelt, smoothing her hair. "This was our home, baby." His voice cracked on the word "was." J.D. felt something inside him harden. Not anger, not yet, but a promise forming, deep and unshakable. He looked at the man, the girl, the street that had forgotten how to be a street, and said low so only they would hear, "This isn't over." The man's eyes flicked up, and for the first time, there was something like hope flickering there. Small, unsure, but there. J.D. turned, taking it all in one last time. But as he started back toward his car, something else caught his attention. The faint sound of hammering, distant but steady. Someone, somewhere, was trying to fix what was broken. Who? Why? The questions stirred in J.D.'s mind. And as he drove away, the sun climbing higher behind him, one thought stayed with him. Not everyone here has given up, and neither will I. As J.D. drove away from the hollowed town, that distant hammering stayed with him, like a heartbeat beneath the silence. His thoughts swirled with the faces he'd just left behind. The father's raw honesty, the little girl's question that hung in the air like fog. This isn't over, he had promised. And as he pulled into the Capitol's underground garage, the weight of that vow settled heavier on his shoulders. Hours later, he stood in his office, the city beyond his window waking up in the pale morning light. The steelworker's pin on his lapel caught the sun just so, a small glint in a world that felt tarnished. He hadn't slept. Instead, he'd replayed every step through that town, every boarded window, every empty porch swing. That's when a knock came, soft but urgent. It was Mark, his youngest aide. Mark was smart, loyal, but his eyes told JD this wasn't just another morning briefing. He shut the door behind him, placed a thin folder on JD's desk, and hesitated. JD raised a brow. "What is it?" Mark swallowed, voice low. "Sir, you're going to want to see this." JD opened the folder, his fingers slow, deliberate. Inside were copies of emails, memos, contracts, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. The names leapt off the pages. Shell companies linked to foreign investors, acquisition deals for entire blocks of housing, legislation pushed through committees with barely a glance, and threaded through it all, Jasmine Crockett's signature, her endorsements, her quiet approvals. The room felt colder. JD's gaze hardened as he read line after line, the puzzle pieces snapping together in a picture he didn't want to see. Foreign interests hadn't just taken advantage of a loophole. They'd been handed the keys. How could this slip past us? The question echoed in his mind, bitter and sharp. This wasn't policy oversight. This was betrayal, carefully dressed as progress. Mark shifted his weight, uneasy. "Sir, there's more. The whistleblower who leaked this, they want to meet. Tonight. Off the record." JD closed the folder, the paper whispering like a warning. He crossed to the window, looking out over the city, the marble and glass, the domes and spires that were supposed to stand for something more than this. His reflection stared back at him, tired but resolute. The father's voice from that broken town echoed again. They built empty shells, took the heart of this place and sold it. No, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Set it up," JD said, voice quiet but firm. "And Mark, make sure no one knows but us." Mark nodded and slipped out, leaving JD alone with the weight of what he now knew. The sun had risen fully, but it felt as if shadows had lengthened instead. Somewhere out there, a deal had been struck that traded futures for fortunes. And now JD understood what he had to do. Not just for that father, not just for that girl, but for every empty home, every stolen dream. He turned back to his desk, the folder still there, like a scar on the polished wood. The promise he'd made hours ago now burned brighter. This isn't over, and for the first time, JD could see the shape of the storm coming. The folder stayed on JD's desk long after Mark had gone. Its weight wasn't in the paper, but in the truth it held. The kind of truth that strips illusions clean. The office was quiet, the hum of the city beyond its walls muffled by thick glass. JD stood by the window, steelworkers pinned between his fingers, turning it slowly, as if the cool metal might steady the storm inside him. Outside, the Capitol loomed, proud and pristine in the morning sun. Its white dome glowed like a promise, but to JD, it felt like a reminder of how far good intentions can fall when no one's watching. He thought of the father and daughter, of the swing that moved without wind, of the hollow streets that once held laughter and life. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, older, wearier, but clearer than it had in years. There comes a moment, JD thought, when knowing demands doing, when silence becomes complicity. And now that moment had come. He turned from the window and sat at his desk, the steelworker's pin placed gently beside him like a silent witness. He reached for a legal pad, its pages crisp and empty, a blank space waiting to carry the weight of his decision. His pen moved, sure and steady. Prepare suit. Claim, $80 million. Purpose, restitution for Main Street communities impacted by foreign real estate. Profiteering facilitated through legislative misconduct. He paused, the tip of the pen hovering. $80 million, a figure that wasn't just about dollars. It was about rebuilding what had been stolen, about proving that the forgotten still mattered. JD knew the road ahead would be brutal. There would be headlines calling it political theater. There would be colleagues who'd look the other way, whisper in back rooms, call him a fool for stirring up a fight he couldn't win. But the alternative, standing by while towns died in silence, that wasn't an option. Not anymore. He jotted notes for his team, compiled documentation, leaked memos, contracts, housing data. Prepare initial press briefing, framing, justice for Main Street, not politics. His handwriting was tight, controlled, but the pulse in his neck beat hard. The sun climbed higher, casting long beams across the polished wood of his desk, glinting off the pen that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who'd worked with hands, not speeches. J.D. touched it once, as if to draw strength. Then he straightened, gathered the papers, and placed them neatly in a folder labeled only with a single word: reckoning. He stood again, looking out at the Capitol, feeling the enormity of what he'd set in motion. The first stone had been cast, not out of vengeance, but out of duty. And as the city stirred to life below, J.D. felt the weight of the promise he carried. This isn't over. And now it was truly beginning. The decision had been made, and now it demanded action. As J.D.'s team gathered in a secured conference room that afternoon, the mood was quiet but charged, the air thick with the weight of what they were about to untangle. The folder marked reckoning lay open at the head of the table, and J.D. stood over it, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp. "This isn't about headlines," J.D. began, voice steady. "It's about what's right, and we follow this wherever it leads." And so they began. Day after day, the team sifted through piles of public records, campaign finance reports, property transactions buried in legalese designed to confuse. What emerged wasn't a single smoking gun, but a pattern. Deliberate, damning, undeniable. There were contracts, housing developments snapped up by shell companies, traced back to foreign investors. There were emails, exchanges between lobbyists and staffers, praising Jasmine's efforts to ease regulatory barriers. There were memos, internal briefings acknowledging that the policies would likely displace working families, but brushing it off as market correction. Mark, the young aide who'd first brought J.D. the leak, uncovered a paper trail that made J.D.'s stomach tighten. An influx of donations funneled through PACs tied to those very investors. The dots connected, no matter how much some had hoped they never would. Late one night, as the team pored over yet another set of records, Mark looked up, eyes wide with something between exhaustion and dread. "Sir," he said, sliding a file toward J.D., "I think this is it." J.D. flipped through the pages, jaw tightening with every line. A lobbyist email, written in the kind of tone only used when the deals felt done and dusted, praised Jasmine directly. "Your leadership in advancing this measure has opened doors beyond what we imagined. The investors are thrilled, and so are we." J.D. sat back, the room silent except for the soft whir of the AC. He closed the file, fingers pressed against the cover as if to contain what it held. And then came the final piece. The voice that would confirm what the paper trail had revealed. The meeting was arranged in a quiet corner booth of a diner well past the dinner rush, the kind of place where no one asked questions and the coffee kept coming. The whistleblower was older than J.D. expected, with eyes that carried the wear of someone who'd stayed too long in a fight they hadn't signed up for. "They knew," the man said simply, hands wrapped around his mug. His voice was tired but clear. "They saw the numbers. They saw what it would do to the towns, and they chose profit." J.D. didn't interrupt. He let the words settle, heavy as they were, into the space between them. The man slid over a thumb drive. "Everything I could get, I kept it because someone had to." J.D. took it, nodded once, and in that moment, what had started as a gut-deep sense of wrong became certainty. The web was real, and now he had the threads in his hands. As he left the diner, stepping into the cool night air, J.D. felt the promise inside him burn brighter. This isn't over, and soon neither would the silence be. The whistleblower's words haunted J.D. as he drove through the city that night, the thumb drive heavy in his pocket. Though it weighed nothing at all, the web of contracts and emails, the donations and memos, they formed a damning map of greed. But numbers on a page, no matter how damning, couldn't speak for themselves. J.D. needed to see, to feel the cost of what had been done. And so before dawn the next morning, he parked along the edge of a strip mall that had seen better days. The lot was quiet, empty except for a battered pickup truck that hadn't moved in weeks. Frost clouded its cracked windshield. JD approached slowly, careful not to startle the man inside. The veteran stirred at the sound of JD's footsteps, blinking against the gray light. His face was weathered, his eyes alert but tired, the look of someone too proud to ask and too honest to lie about where life had left him. A faded Marine Corps cap sat on the dash. JD spoke softly. "Morning." The man nodded once, wary but not unkind. "I'm JD Vance," JD said, though it felt hollow here. "Mind if I sit a minute?" The veteran gestured to the curb. "It's a free country," he said, but there was no bitterness in it, only fact. They sat in silence for a time, the breath of dawn misting in the cold. Finally, JD asked, "How long?" The man shrugged. "Since rent jumped, since work dried up, since promises didn't mean much anymore." JD nodded, no reply necessary. The man glanced at him sideways. "You're him, aren't you? The one going after them?" JD hesitated. "Trying to." The man's gaze returned to the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise. "Then don't just try. Do it. Someone needs to." JD rose, offering his hand. The grip was firm, no self-pity in it, just a quiet strength that refused to break. Later that day, JD visited a shelter on the edge of the district, unannounced, no cameras, no staff alerts. Inside, the air smelled of strong coffee and bleach, a strange mix of comfort and sterility. In a corner, a young mother cradled a toddler, their world reduced to a single cot in a battered suitcase. JD watched her for a moment, then knelt to the child's eye level. The boy clutched a toy car with a missing wheel but smiled anyway, as if determined to find joy where none had been left. The mother's voice was soft. "We had a place. We had a plan. Then the rent doubled overnight." She looked at JD, tired but steady. "They told us we could move into one of the new units, but no one told us they'd never be built." JD felt the anger rise, quiet but fierce. This wasn't policy. This wasn't data. This was theft. Theft of dignity, of stability, of a future. As he stepped back into the cold, the city noise returning around him, JD clenched his fists in his pockets. The faces of the veteran, the mother, the child. They weren't statistics. They weren't cases to be filed or numbers to be cited in court. "This can't be abstract," JD said aloud, to no one but himself. "These are lives." And with that, the road ahead became clearer than ever. The fight wasn't just legal, it was moral, and he would not turn away. The faces of the veteran, the mother, and the child stayed with JD as he left the shelter that evening. Their stories weren't echoes from the past. They were the reality of now, raw and urgent. The promise he'd made silently to each of them pressed heavier on his chest with every mile he drove back toward the capital. By the time his office door closed behind him, the decision was no longer something to consider. It was something to act upon. Through the night, JD and his team prepared. Every fact checked twice. Every figure cross-referenced. Every thread of the web he'd uncovered tied neatly to the case they would bring. There was no room for error. Not here. Not with this much at stake. By morning, the plan was set. The press conference was scheduled for noon. The room chosen was plain. No grand backdrop, no dramatic stage. JD didn't want the story to be about theatrics. He wanted the story to be about truth. As he stepped up to the podium, the cameras clicked in word, reporters jostling for position, the low murmur of anticipation filling the space. JD scanned the room, seeing not the press, but the people beyond these walls, the forgotten communities, the empty homes, the futures sold off piece by piece. He adjusted the microphone, his voice steady, his words chosen with care. "Good afternoon. Today I stand before you not as a politician seeking attention, but as a public servant carrying the weight of communities that have been betrayed." He let that settle, watching the reporter's pen still for just a breath. "In the course of our investigation, we uncovered undeniable evidence of policies and decisions that knowingly and willingly favored foreign investors over American families. These choices hollowed out our towns, drove veterans into trucks and mothers into shelters. And it must stop." JD paused, drawing in a slow breath. The next line mattered most. We are filing a suit demanding $80 million, not for government coffers, not for headlines, but for those who were left behind, for the families who lost their homes, for the communities robbed of their future, for Main Street. The room burst into noise. Shouted questions, cameras zooming closer, flashes popping. JD stayed still, letting the storm rise around him. He'd said what needed saying. The rest would play out as it must. A reporter at the front called above the din, "Senator Vance, is this personal against Congresswoman Crockett?" JD met the reporter's gaze unwavering. This isn't about personal scores. It's about accountability. It's about justice. And it's about time. He stepped back, ending the conference, his team closing ranks as reporters surged forward, hungry for more. JD felt the shift, the quiet before the storm had passed. Now the winds were rising, and he was ready to face them. As he left the building, the Capitol standing tall in the winter sun, he glanced once at its dome, a reminder of what this place was meant to protect. This isn't over, he thought. Now it had truly begun. The press conference had barely ended when Jasmine Crockett's team sprang into action. By sundown, she was booked on major news shows coast to coast, her statement polished, her tone measured. Outwardly, the portrait of a leader unfazed by what she dismissed as political grandstanding. In studios lit too brightly, Jasmine smiled with practiced ease. "Let's be clear," she told one anchor, hands folded neatly, voice calm. "This lawsuit is a distraction. Senator Vance has chosen spectacle over solutions. Instead of working together to address the housing crisis, he's opted for headlines. And frankly, the American people deserve better." The host nodded, eager for sound bites. The segment played across prime time, the clip shared within minutes across social media. The caption bold, "Crockett fires back at Vance." But for all the confidence she projected under studio lights, the calm began to fray when the camera stopped rolling. That night, in the quiet of her private office, Jasmine dropped the practiced smile. The room felt too still, the shadows longer than they should have been. She stared at her reflection in the window. The same reflection that had, until recently, looked back with certainty. Now there was something else in those eyes, a flicker of doubt she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Her chief of staff, a man named Harris who'd served her loyally for years, broke the silence. "You handled that well." Jasmine didn't look away from the glass. "Did I?" Harris hesitated, sensing the weight behind her words. "He's making noise, Jasmine. That's all this is. We've seen it before. Lawsuits like this, they make headlines for a few weeks. Then they fade. You know that." But Jasmine wasn't sure anymore. She turned, pacing slowly, the heels of her shoes quiet on the thick carpet. "It's different this time. He's not shouting in the dark. He's building something. The way people are responding. It's not just noise." Harris stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Then we counter. We stay on message. We remind people of what you've done for them, not what he claims you've done to them." Jasmine stopped pacing, facing him. "Do we have clean hands, Harris?" The question hung heavy between them. He didn't answer right away. "Politics isn't clean. You know that." She nodded slowly, as if confirming a truth she'd long known, but tried not to see. Outside, in the city she helped govern, the lights of the Capitol flickered against the night. In homes and shelters, in trucks parked at the edge of forgotten lots, people watched and waited for answers, for change, for the truth that no soundbite could deliver. Jasmine exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The next morning would bring more interviews, more statements, more efforts to hold the line. But in this quiet hour, she felt the storm on the horizon. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if the wall she'd built would hold. The days that followed turned into a whirlwind. Where Jasmine's polished sound bites tried to steady the storm, JD's declaration had already stirred it beyond anyone's control. Across the country, town halls filled with citizens demanding answers, and not always the same ones. In a packed community center on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, JD stood before an audience of steelworkers and small business owners, their faces lined with the hard years of economic struggle. The applause as he entered was warm, but it carried the weight of expectation. A man near the back rose, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Senator, We appreciate what you're doing, the man said, nodding toward JD. But how does a lawsuit put food on the table next month? How does it fix what's broken now? JD listened, nodded, then spoke plainly. I won't pretend a lawsuit solves everything overnight, but it holds people accountable, and it starts to rebuild trust where it's been broken. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others exchanging doubtful glances. Elsewhere, the mood was different. At a town hall in suburban Ohio, JD's presence drew sharp questions from a mixed crowd. A woman, well-dressed and firm-voiced, stood and spoke with clipped precision. This lawsuit, Senator, it feels like a stunt, like you're deepening divides when we need unity. Why target a colleague when you could work together on solutions? JD met her gaze, weighing his words carefully. Because unity built on silence isn't real. We can't move forward by ignoring what's broken. Her frown deepened, but she said nothing more. The media caught every moment, headlines flashing across screens and feeds. Vance, the hero or the divider? Lawsuit sparks debate over justice and unity. Crockett, Vance, and the fractured middle class. In quieter moments between the storm of appearances, JD felt the toll. One night, after another long day of meetings and travel, he sat alone in his office. City lights blinking beyond the window. The steelworker's pin rested on his desk, glinting faintly in the lamp's glow. He turned it between his fingers, mind heavy with the voices he'd heard. The man who wanted action now, the woman who pleaded for unity, the veteran who'd said, don't just try, do it. Was he doing it? JD asked himself, truly? Or was the fight pulling at the very fabric he meant to protect? He thought of the father in the truck, the mother in the shelter, the towns that still stood silent. This isn't over, he reminded himself. But for the first time, the weight of the cost pressed hard against his chest. And outside, as America debated in living rooms, diners, and union halls, the divide widened. Between those who saw a warrior for justice and those who feared a deepening rift that might not heal. JD rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the Capitol dome. The question stayed with him. Could the fight to save the country tear it further apart? And yet, in his heart, he knew not fighting wasn't an option at all. JD's question, whether the fight to heal could also divide, stayed with him through sleepless nights and long miles. But as the country debated and town halls grew tenser, something unexpected began to shift the ground beneath Jasmine Crockett's confident footing. It started quietly. A leaked document, no one knew or admitted knowing where it had come from, surfaced online. At first, it was dismissed as another rumor in the noisy digital flood. But within hours, the memo was authenticated, and its words hit harder than any accusation JD had made. Dated months before the legislation passed, the memo was blunt, stripped of the careful language politicians usually wrapped around hard truths. It detailed projections showing how the housing bill could lead to displacement of low-income families. It acknowledged the optics risk of foreign investors buying up properties at accelerated rates. And most damning of all, it included a line that echoed in headlines nationwide. The benefits to economic partners outweigh anticipated localized hardship. News outlets pounced. The tone of coverage shifted, no longer framing JD as a lone crusader stirring trouble, but as the one who had forced open a door that should never have been shut. Leaked memo exposes Crockett's team weighed harm, chose profit, blared one network. Vance's case gains traction as documents surface, read another. On talk radio, on cable panels, at kitchen tables, Americans asked the same thing. How much did she know, and why didn't she stop it? Inside Jasmine's office, the mood had changed. The phone rang endlessly. Reporters, donors, allies now unsure whether to stand close or step back. Jasmine read the memo in full, for what felt like the 100th time, fingers tight on the paper's edge. Harris, her chief of staff, stood near the window, watching the Capitol lights blink against the night. We need a plan, he said quietly. Jasmine didn't look up. A plan for what? The words are right there. No spin changes that. He hesitated. Then we remind people of what we've done. We control the message. We show the bigger picture. The jobs created, the investments made. She shook her head, voice low. They won't hear that now. Not after this. Harris started to reply but stopped. The truth hung too heavy between them. Across town, JD read the memo, the same tight knot forming in his chest. He hadn't leaked it. That much he knew. But as he scanned the damning words, he understood what they meant. The tide was turning, not because of his speeches, but because the truth had a power all its own. Still, he felt no triumph, only the weight of what lay ahead. This isn't over, he thought again. The phrase no longer a promise, but a responsibility that grew heavier by the day. And as the news cycle raged, as public opinion shifted like a storm-tossed sea, Jasmine felt, for the first time, the armor she'd built around herself begin to crack. The memo changed everything, and nothing. The headlines had shifted, the public tide had turned, but for J.D. Vance, the work only deepened. That night, long after the cameras had stopped rolling and the voices of pundits faded from the airwaves, he sat alone in his office, the weight of it all pressing heavier than ever. The room was dim, lit only by a single desk lamp that cast long shadows across stacks of papers, printouts, and legal briefs. J.D.'s jacket lay draped over the back of a chair. His sleeves were rolled, his tie loosened at the collar. The steelworker's pin, polished smooth at the edges from years of being handled, rested beside his elbow as he worked. Outside, the Capitol glowed under floodlights, its dome bright against the deep black of night. It was beautiful, unchanging, a symbol meant to steady those who serve beneath it. But tonight to J.D., it felt like a silent witness, watching, demanding, reminding him that duty wasn't about comfort or rest or certainty. He flipped through page after page of evidence, highlighting, annotating, cross-referencing. The leaked memo had opened the floodgates. More documents had followed, emails between staffers, financial disclosures no one had paid attention to before, contracts that now read like confessions. The web was no longer hidden. It was mapped, every thread in stark relief, impossible to deny. And yet J.D. felt no victory, only the gravity of what came next. A lawsuit wasn't just a filing or a statement at a podium. It was a battle, one that would demand precision, patience, resilience. He could feel the fatigue in his bones, the weight behind his eyes, but he kept reading, kept marking, because he knew the other side wouldn't sleep either. Somewhere beneath the layers of legal language and technical jargon were the stories that mattered. The father who had lived in his truck, the mother who had made a shelter a home because she had no choice. J.D. thought of them now, saw their faces in the margins of every page. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. The city beyond the glass grew quieter, but inside his office the storm still raged. J.D. paused, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes drifting to the Capitol's dome. This building belongs to them, he thought, to the people who trusted us to protect them, not sell them out. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Mark entered quietly, holding 2 mugs of coffee, setting one down without a word. J.D. offered a tired smile of thanks, then turned back to the files. Mark hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we're ready. The case is solid." J.D. nodded slowly. "Good, because they'll fight like hell to stop it." He stared at the pile of evidence one last time that night, knowing tomorrow would bring the next step, a step he couldn't take back. The responsibility felt heavier than ever, but beneath it, there was clarity. The fight wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing in the court of public opinion. It was about duty. Plain and simple, and J.D. Vance had no intention of failing it. The night after poring over evidence until his eyes ached, J.D. stepped out of his office into the crisp air of the city. He hadn't planned to attend the vigil. Word of it had reached his staff, but it hadn't been on the schedule. And yet, as he stood at the edge of the small park where a handful of candles flickered against the dark, he felt as if he'd been drawn there by something he couldn't name. The gathering was quiet, solemn. Families who had lost homes, neighbors who had watched their communities hollow out, veterans who had returned to find nothing waiting for them. Their faces were tired, but in their eyes shone a stubborn light that no amount of betrayal could snuff out. J.D. moved among them unnoticed at first. his coat collar turned up against the cold, hands deep in his pockets. He didn't come to speak. He came to listen. A soft chorus of a hymn drifted through the air, the kind sung more for comfort than for show. Then he saw her, a girl no older than 8, her coat too thin for the night, her hands clutching something small and crumpled. She stood apart from the others, gaze fixed on the candles as if willing their light to reach further than it could. As JD approached, she turned to him without fear, without hesitation, and held out the paper in her hand. The edges were worn soft, the writing shaky but clear. "Please help us find a home," it read. JD knelt so they were eye to eye, taking the note gently, as if it were something fragile. "What's your name, Ma?" he asked. "Ellie," she whispered. "Ellie," he said, the name settling deep in his heart. "Thank you for trusting me with this." She nodded once, solemn as any adult, and turned back toward the candles, the soft glow reflected in her wide, hopeful eyes. JD rose slowly, the letter in his hand feeling heavier than any file he'd studied, any memo he'd read. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket, close to his heart, a promise made without words. The crowd began to thin, the night pressing colder, but JD remained a moment longer. The Capitol dome rose in the distance, brilliant under the floodlights, a beacon that too often failed to shine where it was most needed. This isn't just evidence, JD thought. It isn't just a case. It's Ellie. It's all of them, and we owe them better. As he walked back toward his car, his steps felt surer, the fatigue of the past days tempered by resolve. The letter stayed warm against him, a reminder that the fight ahead wasn't about the headlines or the politics or even the lawsuit. It was about children like Ellie who still believed enough to ask for help. And as the city settled into sleep, JD knew that whatever came next, the hearings, the backlash, the uphill battle, he would carry Ellie's words with him, a beacon of his own, guiding him through the storm. While JD walked the quiet streets with Ellie's letter close to his heart, across the city, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her private office, the glow of her desk lamp casting sharp lines across stacks of files she hadn't wanted to reopen. The Capitol's dome loomed beyond the glass, the same symbol she'd once drawn strength from. Tonight, it felt more like a judgment than a shield. The room was silent, but for the soft scratch of her pen as she jotted notes on a yellow legal pad. Lines crossed out, words circled, thoughts abandoned as quickly as they came. The memo leak had shaken everything. But it wasn't just the memo anymore. It was the emails, the contracts, the mounting evidence that JD's team had uncovered and brought into the light. What once felt like distant risks, carefully managed and hidden behind political messaging, now loomed large, undeniable, and dangerously real. She flipped through another binder, eyes scanning figures she no longer trusted, explanations she no longer believed. The more she reviewed, the clearer the cracks became. Not just in the case JD was building, but in the walls she had so carefully erected around herself. The door creaked open, and Harris stepped inside, his tie loosened, his face lined with the wear of too many sleepless nights. He didn't speak right away, closing the door gently behind him, as if unwilling to let the storm outside seep in any faster than it already had. Jasmine didn't look up. "Tell me you have good news." Harris hesitated, and that was answer enough. He crossed the room, placed a folder on her desk. "It's worse than we thought. Another whistleblower came forward. Not to us, to the press. Tomorrow's headlines are going to hit hard." Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment, willing the weight of the words to lessen, knowing they wouldn't. "How bad?" Harris's voice was quiet. "Bad. And this time, we may not win." The admission hung heavy between them. For all the years they'd worked together, through every crisis managed, every fire put out, Harris had never said those words. Not once. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling as if the answers might be hidden there. "How did it come to this, Harris?" "We started out trying to help. We really did." He nodded, folding his arms. "I know. But somewhere along the way, deals piled on deals. Compromises became strategy. And now here we are." She sighed, the sound hollow in the quiet room. The Capitol lights flickered beyond the window, steady and cold. "Do they even remember the good we tried to do?" Harris didn't answer. Maybe because he couldn't. Maybe because he knew the question wasn't meant for him. Jasmine rose, crossing to the window. From here, the city stretched out beneath her, a patchwork of lights and shadows, promises kept and promises broken. She saw the reflection of herself in the glass, the polished image she'd shown the world now blurred and fragile. "I don't want to lose," she said at last, her voice soft. "But more than that, I don't want to deserve to lose." Harris watched her, silent, the unspoken truth between them too sharp for words. In the distance, sirens wailed, a reminder that the world outside kept turning, uncaring of political battles or moral reckonings. Jasmine placed a hand on the window pane, the glass cold against her palm. Tomorrow she would stand before cameras again. She would fight the headlines, the accusations, the rising tide of JD's case. But tonight, in this quiet hour, she allowed herself to feel the doubt she'd kept at bay, and wondered for the first time whether she still stood on solid ground at all. The night's doubt gave way to the cold light of morning, but for Jasmine Crockett, it brought no comfort. As the black car carried her toward the Capitol, she kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching the city blur past. The monuments, the scaffolds of new buildings, the faces of citizens lining the sidewalks. She wondered how many of them would be watching. She wondered how many already had their minds made up. Inside the hearing chamber, the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters packed the press section, cameras positioned at every angle, microphones tuned to catch every word, every pause, every breath. The room hummed with low conversation as members of the committee settled into their seats, staffers handed out last-minute documents, and the nation, through television screens, radio stations, and live streams, leaned in to witness what would unfold. J.D. Vance sat at the witness table, his posture straight, his expression composed but resolute. Before him lay a stack of evidence, each piece carefully prepared, copies of contracts, financial statements, internal memos, email threads, a mosaic of betrayal now ready to be revealed in full. The steelworker's pin was fastened at his lapel, the smallest of symbols, yet to J.D. it felt like armor. Jasmine entered moments later, shoulders squared, her steps measured. From afar, she looked every bit the confident leader, but those who knew her best, Harris seated behind her, saw the tightness in her jaw, the flicker of tension in her eyes. The chair of the committee called the session to order, the gavel's sharp crack echoing through the chamber. Silence followed, the kind that felt heavy with history. J.D. was the first to speak. His voice, amplified across the room and beyond, was steady. "Madam Chair, members of this committee, and to the American people watching today, I appear before you not out of ambition or rivalry, but out of duty. What I present is not conjecture, not theory. It is fact, and it demands accountability." He opened the first folder, lifting a document for all to see. "This is a contract authorizing the sale of residential blocks to an entity later revealed to be a front for foreign investors. This was approved without review of community impact." He placed it down, lifting another. "This is an internal memo projecting the displacement of over 4,000 families as a result of housing legislation. A memo acknowledged, but ignored." One by one, he laid out the evidence, each piece tightening the net, each figure, each signature, each line of text painting a picture of negligence and betrayal. Jasmine sat silent, hands clasped before her, feeling the weight of every word, every document displayed. The cameras caught her stillness, her composure, but inside her mind raced, weighing responses, searching for footing, knowing the moment would come when she'd have to speak, to answer, to defend. As J.D. concluded, his final words rang clear. "This is not about politics. It is about people, about communities left behind, about the duty we owe to those who place their trust in us." The chair nodded, signaling the next phase of the hearing. And as questions began to flow, as the nation watched the battle unfold, J.D. and Jasmine both knew the storm had arrived and there was no turning back. The evidence had been laid out, document by document, number by number. The hearing chamber felt heavier now, as if the weight of the truth was pressing down on everyone inside. JD stood still for a moment after placing the last contract on the table, letting the silence fill the space. Then, without a word, he reached to his side, took hold of a covered easel, and drew back the cloth. A large map unfurled, not the kind of polished, color-coded graphic often used in hearings, but something stark and raw. It showed towns across the heartland, marked in faded reds and grays. Once thriving communities, now gutted by the consequences of decisions made in rooms like this one. Small dots, each representing lives upended, dreams displaced, homes lost to promises that had never materialized. JD let the map speak first. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when words feel too small. Cameras zoomed in, screens across the nation filled with the image. This, JD began, his voice low but clear, is the real cost, not numbers on a spreadsheet, not forecasts in a report. These are the places that paid the price, and these are the people who were asked to pay it. He turned, his hand resting briefly on the map. Each of these towns, they're more than dots. They're families, workers, veterans, children. He paused, pulling a folded slip of paper from his jacket pocket, the edges soft from being carried close. His fingers smoothed it carefully before he began to read. Please help us find a home. The words, simple and small, filled the chamber in a way no figure or chart ever could. JD's voice softened, but every ear strained to catch it. This letter was handed to me by a little girl at a vigil, a girl whose world had been reduced to a cot in a shelter, a battered suitcase, and a hope that someone, anyone, would hear her plea. He let the words settle, let the silence deepen. Outside the chamber, across televisions, radios, phones, Americans listened. For that moment, the noise of politics, of arguments, of division fell away. JD folded the letter again, placing it gently on the table as if it were something sacred. His eyes swept the room. We talk so much about policy, about strategy, but policy should serve people, and strategy should never come at the cost of a child's home, a veteran's dignity, a community's future. Even those who had come prepared to defend or deflect felt the moment. Even those who disagreed with JD's methods found themselves unable to look away. Jasmine sat motionless, her expression unreadable, the words of the letter echoing in her mind louder than any accusation. JD stepped back from the map, letting it stand as a silent indictment, as visible and undeniable as the evidence laid out beside it. This isn't about me. It isn't about one lawsuit. It's about them. And we owe them more than excuses. We owe them action. The chair of the committee nodded, her face grave. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras captured every angle, and somewhere in the vast audience watching, Ellie's simple words stayed with them. Please help us find a home. And for that moment, in a chamber too often filled with noise, the nation held its breath. The map remained at the front of the chamber, stark in its accusation, while the folded letter rested on the table like a quiet reminder of what had been lost. JD stepped back to his seat, his part said, his voice now silent, but the echoes of his words filled the space, and for a long breath no one moved. All eyes turned to Jasmine. The chair of the committee gave her the floor, her voice almost gentle as she spoke. Congresswoman Crockett, you may respond. Jasmine rose slowly, smoothing the front of her suit with hands that trembled ever so slightly. The cameras captured her every movement, the nation watching as she stepped toward the microphone. Her expression was composed, the practiced mask of a politician, long accustomed to pressure. But behind her eyes the storm raged. She began with measured calm. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator Vance, for your presentation. I want to be clear. I have always acted with the best interests of my constituents at heart. Her voice held steady, but her words felt thin, as if she too could hear how hollow they sounded against the weight of the evidence laid bare. She spoke of economic growth, of new investment, of difficult decisions made for the greater good. But each point she raised seemed to shrink beneath the shadow of the map behind her, beneath the memory of that simple, devastating plea. Please help us find a home. As she referenced policies meant to stimulate development, JD's documents, the contracts, the memos, the emails, stood in silent contradiction. As she spoke of opportunity, the dots on the map spoke louder, each one a town left behind. Reporters watched, pens stilled, committee members exchanged glances, the shift in the room unmistakable. This wasn't defense. This was unraveling. Jasmine paused, searching the faces before her, hoping for a sign of support, of understanding. Instead, she saw what she feared most: doubt. Not anger, not outrage. Just the quiet realization spreading through the room, the understanding that her words could not match the facts, could not erase the truth JD had brought forward. Her closest aide, seated behind her, lowered his gaze, knowing as she did that the tide had turned. Jasmine's voice softened as she neared the end. We made decisions based on information we had at the time, in the best interest of progress. I regret if unintended consequences caused harm. That was never my intent. But intent no longer mattered. The harm was done, and the nation had seen it laid bare. As Jasmine returned to her seat, the chamber felt changed. Where before there had been argument, now there was reckoning. Where there had been noise, now there was clarity. And in that clarity stood J.D. Vance, not as a man seeking political gain, not as an opportunist looking for the next headline, but as the one who had spoken for those who could not, the one who had carried their stories into the halls of power and demanded they be heard. The hearing moved on, but the breaking point had come, and from that moment, the narrative no longer belonged to sound bites or spin. It belonged to the truth, and to what would come next. The hearing had ended, but the ripples it sent through Washington and far beyond had only just begun. By morning, headlines across the nation echoed a single theme: the reckoning, the map of shame, Ellie's letter, JD's steady voice, Jasmine's faltering defense, all played and replayed across television screens, radio broadcasts, and the endless scroll of digital feeds. Inside Jasmine's once loyal circle, silence replaced strategy. Calls from former allies went unanswered, or worse, returned with vague regrets and polite distance. The donors who had filled campaign coffers grew quiet, their statements carefully worded, their checks conspicuously absent. Those who had once stood beside her at podiums now found reasons to be elsewhere. In meetings that followed, Jasmine sat at the head of long tables where she had once commanded the room. Now every suggestion met with hesitation. Every plan felt half-hearted, as if the end had already arrived, and all that remained was the sorting of pieces. She scrolled through news coverage late into the night, seeing herself framed not as a leader, but as the face of broken promises. The collapse of Crockett's credibility, how greed undid a rising star. The words blurred together, but their meaning cut sharp, and still, through it all, J.D. Vance kept his distance from the noise. He gave no victory speeches, claimed no personal triumph. His focus remained where it had been from the start, on those left behind. In small meetings far from the cameras, he sat with housing advocates, community leaders, veterans groups, not to gloat, but to plan. The victory wasn't in headlines. It would come, he knew, only when foundations were poured, when keys were placed into the hands of those who'd been shut out, when Main Street found its footing again. Mark entered his office late one evening, a stack of clippings in hand. "The press is calling you the hero of Main Street, sir." J.D. shook his head. This was never about heroes. It's about setting things right. He looked out over the Capitol, its dome steady against the deepening dusk. The same building that had watched over betrayal had also borne witness to accountability. Now it would watch over the work of repair. Meanwhile, Jasmine moved through her days in the shadow of what had been. Each handshake felt colder, each glance sharper with judgment. The halls that had echoed with her ambitions now felt vast and empty. Harris stayed at her side, as loyal in the fall as he had been in the rise. But even he knew, as she did, that the tide had turned and there would be no turning it back. One evening, as Jasmine left the Capitol through a side entrance to avoid cameras, she paused at the steps and looked out at the city she had fought to shape. In that quiet moment, stripped of pretense, stripped of power, she whispered words no one else heard. "I tried." And somewhere across town, in a modest meeting room with no reporters in sight, J.D. Vance mapped out the first rebuilding project, his pen moving steady across the page. His thoughts remained fixed not on what had fallen, but on what could still be built. The judgment came quietly, with none of the spectacle that had surrounded the hearings. No flashing cameras, no breaking news banners splashed across screens, just the steady voice of a judge reading a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The court found in favor of J.D.'s case, awarding $80 million to be held in trust for the rebuilding of the towns and neighborhoods hollowed by the deals at the heart of the suit. When the news broke, the headlines were subdued compared to the fever pitch of earlier weeks. $80 million awarded for community recovery. Vance case ends in major victory for Main Street. But for J.D., the real victory wasn't in headlines. It was in what came next. He wasted no time. With the ink barely dry on the judgment, J.D. gathered a team, not of political strategists or PR experts, but of builders, housing advocates, local leaders, and veterans representatives. Around a table worn smooth by use, they mapped out a plan that didn't begin with ceremonies or photo ops, but with foundations. This isn't about symbolism, J.D. told them. It's about roofs over heads. It's about jobs. It's about dignity. They worked through the night, identifying the hardest-hit communities, prioritizing projects not by politics, but by need. Town by town, block by block, they charted where the funds would go, restoring housing stock, reopening shuttered community centers, rebuilding the infrastructure that allowed small businesses to thrive. And as the work began, J.D. was there, not with speeches, but with rolled sleeves and listening ears. He stood with mayors and pastors, with shop owners and veterans, asking what they needed most, how the funds could help not just in the short term, but for generations to come. Ellie's letter remained in his breast pocket throughout, a constant reminder of who this work was truly for. In one of the first towns to receive funds, J.D. toured the remnants of a neighborhood once vibrant, now quiet but not forgotten. He walked with a local carpenter who had lived through the rise and fall, who now led the crew rebuilding homes one frame at a time. The man's hands were rough, his voice steady. "We thought no one saw us," he said as they stood beside a newly poured foundation. J.D. met his gaze. "We see you, and we're not done." There were no grand announcements, no banners declaring victory. The progress was slow, measured in bricks laid, windows hung, doors rehung where they'd once been boarded shut. But for every family that returned, for every small business that reopened its doors, the $80 million became more than a number on a judgment. It became hope, made solid in timber and stone. J.D. kept the focus there, where it belonged. The cameras came and went, the headlines faded, but the work continued. He declined interviews that sought to paint him as the hero of the hour, redirecting attention to the communities themselves, to the resilience that had never truly left them. And through it all, the Capitol dome remained in the distance, watching over a city where promises had been broken, and at long last where some had been kept. Weeks of rebuilding had begun to reshape the forgotten corners of towns once left behind. The noise of politics faded, replaced by the sound of hammers striking nails, saws biting through timber, and the steady rhythm of hope taking root again. For J.D. Vance, these were the moments that mattered. Not headlines, not speeches, but the quiet work of repair. That morning, the air was crisp with the promise of spring. J.D. stood at the edge of a newly rebuilt block, where homes, once abandoned, now stood sturdy and clean, waiting for families to return. No podium, no cameras, just him, the local crew, and a family that had never stopped believing the day would come when they could come home. The father was a veteran J.D. recognized from those early town halls, a man who had spoken up when so many stayed silent. His wife stood beside him, holding the hand of a young boy whose wide eyes took in the house like it was a castle. J.D. stepped forward, the weight of the keys warm in his palm. He didn't offer a speech. There was no need. Instead, he pressed the keys into the father's hand, their grips firm in shared understanding. "This is what justice looks like," J.D. said quietly. The man's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing us, for not forgetting." J.D. shook his head. "You were never forgotten. Not really. And now, this is yours." The boy darted forward, pulling at his father's hand, eager to cross the threshold. The door opened with a soft creak, and sunlight spilled across floors that smelled of fresh wood and new beginnings. JD stood back, watching as the family stepped inside, their laughter carrying through the air like the sweetest sound he'd heard in months. For a moment, JD allowed himself to simply take it in. The way the light fell across the rebuilt street, the hum of work continuing in the distance, the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The $80 million wasn't just money. It was moments like this, multiplied across towns and neighborhoods that had nearly been lost. Mark approached from behind, voice low. "We've got another ribbon cutting scheduled tomorrow, and a school board wants to meet next week about using part of the funds for after-school programs." JD nodded, his gaze still on the house where the family disappeared into their new home. "Good. Let's keep going. There's more work to do." And as he turned to walk back toward the crew, the Capitol dome faint in the distance, JD felt the promise he had made. To Ellie, to Main Street, to the people who had waited so long, settle finally into something real. The fight wasn't over, but today, for one family, the promise had been kept. The house keys had changed hands. The laughter of children echoed down streets, once silent. And for a moment, J.D. Vance allowed himself to believe that perhaps the hardest part was done. But as he stood behind the curtain, waiting for the national broadcast to begin, he knew the truth. Rebuilding houses was only the start. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding unity, that was the work that lay ahead. The address had been his team's idea. The nation had watched the hearings, the judgment, the first wave of restoration. Now, they argued, it was time for JD to speak directly to Americans, not as a plaintiff in a lawsuit, not as a senator seeking re-election, but as a servant of the people who had lived through the storm and still stood ready to face what came next. The red light on the camera blinked on. The country, from coast to coast, turned their attention to the screen, and JD began. "Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I stand before you not to claim victory, not to point fingers, not to reopen wounds. I stand before you to ask, what kind of nation do we want to be when the dust settles, when the cameras turn away, when the headlines fade?" His voice was steady, quiet enough to make the viewers lean in, strong enough to remind them why they had watched him walk this path. We have faced hard truths together. We've seen how easy it is to let ambition cloud duty, to let promises to the powerful drown out promises to the people. But we've also seen something greater. We've seen that when it matters most, we can choose better. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. We chose truth. We chose each other. JD let the words hang in the air, knowing they would echo beyond the walls of the studio, beyond the hour of the broadcast. The lawsuit was never the end. It was a beginning, a reminder that accountability is not a punishment. It is a promise kept, and that promise belongs not to me, not to any one office or official, but to all of us. To every worker rebuilding a home, to every teacher reopening a classroom, to every veteran finding a place to rest his head at night. He shifted, hands resting lightly on the podium, his gaze steady on the lens. But if we stop here, if we let division take root in the soil of what we've achieved, we will have built nothing lasting. So tonight I ask you, let's choose unity beyond the lawsuit. Let's choose the harder path, to listen, to learn, to work together. Let's build a future that no map of shame can ever mark again. Outside the studio, the city lights flickered against the night, quiet witnesses to the address. In living rooms, diners, firehouses, and shelters, Americans watched, some with hope, some with doubt, but all with the shared knowledge that something had shifted. JD's final words were simple, unadorned. Thank you for trusting me to speak. Now let's trust each other enough to act. And as the broadcast ended, as screens dimmed and the night deepened, the work of unity, the hardest work of all, had begun. The broadcast ended, but its words lingered in places far from the Capitol or the camera lights. In a small town miles from the headlines, a civics classroom buzzed softly with the hum of a projector. The teacher, a man with silver at his temples and the kind of voice that commanded attention without needing to raise it, dimmed the lights, and queued up the recording of J.D. Vance's address. The students, most of them no strangers to the struggles J.D. had spoken of, watched in silence. They saw the map of shame, heard the words of the letter J.D. had carried close, listened as he called the nation not just to reflection, but to action. For a few minutes after the video ended, no one spoke. The usual restlessness of the room had stilled, replaced by a quiet that felt respectful, thoughtful. The teacher broke the silence gently. "What do you think J.D. Vance was trying to tell us?" A hand went up. A boy near the back, small for his age but sharp-eyed, the kind who always watched more than he spoke. His voice was tentative at first. "That we can fix things, even big things." The teacher nodded. "That's right. That the fight for what's right doesn't end with one hearing or one lawsuit. It begins there." The boy glanced around as if making sure no one would laugh, then asked the question that had been building in his mind. "Could I do that one day? Like, stand up like that?" The teacher smiled, the kind of smile that said he'd been waiting for someone to ask. "Yes, you could. That's what civics is, what this country's supposed to be about. But it starts here, with understanding, with paying attention, with caring enough to try." Other students stirred, emboldened by the boy's courage. A girl near the front leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "But isn't it scary to stand up when people don't want you to?" The teacher's answer was simple. "Yes, it is. But that's when it matters most." Outside, the world went on. Cars passed, phones buzzed, lives hurried forward. But inside that classroom, something quieter and more lasting took root. The idea that the hearing wasn't just history, it was a call, a challenge, a possibility. The teacher switched off the projector and let the light back into the room. "Tomorrow we'll talk more about what comes next, about what duty means, about how justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you help build." As the students filed out, the boy who had spoken first lagged behind, staring once more at the paused image on the screen. J.D. Vance standing firm, map behind him, letter in hand. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The seed had been planted, and the echo of that hearing, of that map, of that promise kept, would stay with him, and with all of them, long after the lesson ended. The echoes of J.D.'s words in that small-town classroom were just beginning to ripple outward. But for J.D. himself, the moment for speeches had passed. The hearings were over. The lawsuits decided. The rebuilding begun. Now came the part he had always known mattered most. The part without cameras, without headlines, where the work was quiet and constant. On this morning, before the city fully woke, J.D. stood alone at the top of the Capitol steps. The first light of dawn spilled across the marble, soft and golden, painting the dome in gentle hues that made it look less like a monument and more like a promise. The air was still, the hum of traffic not yet begun, the city holding its breath between night and day. Above him, the flag stirred in the breeze, its edges catching the light, its colors bright against the pale sky. J.D. watched it for a long time, the steelworker's pin at his lapel warm from where his hand had rested over it. He thought of all that had brought him to this point. The hollowed towns, the father living in his truck, Ellie's letter, the map marked by shame, the faces in the hearing room as the truth was laid bare. He thought of the family who now slept beneath a roof they could call their own. He thought of the boy in the classroom, asking, "Could I do that one day?" The Capitol loomed behind him, silent but watchful. J.D. knew that even in victory, the work was far from done. The wounds of betrayal didn't heal overnight. The divisions laid bare in the fight would not vanish with a court's ruling. But here, in this still hour, there was a kind of peace. He let out a slow breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs. His final thought, as the city began to stir below and the sun crested higher over the horizon, was simple, quiet, and true. Not for applause, for what's right. And with that, J.D. turned, descending the steps not as a man seeking praise, but as a servant returning to the work that justice, at its best, always demands. The flag above him kept waving, steady in the dawn, a reminder that the quietest victories are often the ones that matter most. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't measured by applause or headlines, but by the quiet choices made for the good of others. JD's journey shows how standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, can mend what once seemed broken. His fight wasn't about personal glory, it was about restoring hope, dignity, and trust. The ripple of his actions, from the Capitol to classrooms, proves that courage and integrity leave a lasting legacy. Question for you. If you had the chance, how would you stand up for what's right in your community? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.